The sound of the steel door slamming behind Larry Hoover wasn't just the end of freedom, it was the beginning of legend. Inside ADX Florence, they called it the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a concrete tomb designed to bury men alive in silence. But for Hoover, silence was never an option. Even from inside America's most secure prison, his name still echoed through the streets of Chicago like a ghost refusing to die. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. By the time Hoover arrived at ADX in the late 1990s, his reputation had already outgrown any cell. He wasn't just an inmate, he was an institution. As founder of the Gangster Disciples, his word once carried more power than city officials. Even the guards knew, this wasn't another prisoner, they were housing a movement. Florence didn't trust him. They sealed him in a cell the size of a walk-in closet, no windows, no voices, 23 hours of isolation. His meals slid through a steel slot. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent light that never turned off. Yet, somehow, word still traveled. Outside those walls, coded messages kept the disciples alive. Orders disguised as legal notes. Prayers that sounded like strategy. The Bureau of Prisons called it administrative control. Inmate whispers called it something else, fear. Because everyone knew that if Hoover could control a gang from solitary confinement, ADX was losing its own war. He was locked down tighter than any man in America. But the legend of King Larry was still expanding, crossing state lines, shaping rap lyrics, influencing culture. Even celebrities referenced him without ever meeting him. To the streets, he was a myth. To the system, a threat that refused to fade. Hoover's story wasn't just about crime, it was about power. How it survives confinement. How it seeps through walls. And on a freezing Colorado night, something happened that would prove power doesn't need freedom, it only needs belief. A guard discovered a letter. Not just any letter, a coded manifesto written on legal paper, hidden beneath Hoover's mattress. It spoke of restructuring, unity, and something new rising from the ashes of the Gangster Disciples. By dawn, the entire cell block was on lockdown. Hoover's name was whispered from one isolation unit to another, like a spark racing through dry wood. The administration thought they had contained him. They thought Florence could silence the man the streets called a prophet. But when the FBI decrypted the letter, what they found wasn't just communication, it was a blueprint for an underground movement still loyal to the man they'd buried alive. And that night, for the first time in years, the control unit's cameras caught something they couldn't explain, a coded sign drawn on the concrete wall, glowing faintly under the flicker of the light. Hoover wasn't supposed to have contact with anyone. But someone, somewhere, was still listening. Power doesn't vanish in isolation, it mutates. ADX Florence was built to erase identity. But Larry Hoover refused to disappear. The government called him inmate number 86063-024. To his followers, he was still Chairman Hoover. Even locked down 23 hours a day, his mind operated like a command center, calculating, adapting, waiting. The Bureau of Prisons thought they'd won. No phone, no visitors without glass between them, no physical contact for decades. But power has its own frequency. Messages started moving again, quietly, cleverly. Legal mail to lawyers who passed them to community outreach groups. Religious pamphlets that doubled as manifestos. Letters full of parables that only the disciples understood. It wasn't violence anymore, it was ideology. Hoover began preaching growth and development, a rebranding meant to turn the Gangster Disciples into a civic organization. Some said it was reform. Others said it was camouflage. Inside Florence, that blurred line between peace and power scared everyone. Guards watched him like a hawk. Every word in and out was scanned, copied, analyzed. But there was something about Hoover, they said even his silence carried weight. When he walked past the food slot, other inmates went quiet. When his name was whispered, it carried a tone closer to faith than fear. In 2004, an internal memo leaked. The Bureau suspected Hoover still had influence over street operations in Chicago. Millions of dollars moved in patterns that traced back to coded phrases in his old messages. The FBI called it organizational control through psychological continuity. Translation: even buried in concrete, he was still the heartbeat of a system that refused to die. Inside Florence, the tension thickened. Gang hierarchies clashed with prison rules. Hoover's very existence became a symbol, the idea that a man could be invisible yet everywhere. The administration tightened security again. Cell searches became constant. His books were confiscated. His correspondence censored. But suppression doesn't kill belief, it amplifies it. One guard later admitted off record, when Hoover spoke, men didn't just listen. They changed how they carried themselves the next day. Psychologists began to take interest. They studied him like a case file, how charisma survived sensory deprivation. How a man could lose all contact with the world yet still influence it. But deep inside, Hoover was also changing. Decades of isolation don't just test strength, they erode identity. The walls start whispering back. Some say he began questioning what he'd built. Others say he doubled down, convinced that the system feared his ideas, not his crimes. And then came the day the Bureau tried to move him, to transfer him from Florence's control unit to another Block 4 evaluation. But when they opened that cell door, something unexpected happened. Hoover refused to move. Calmly. Without violence. He just said one sentence: "You can move my body, but you'll never move my voice." The warden ordered the extraction team anyway. But when they entered the cell, they found something written across the wall in tiny, scratched letters, almost invisible unless light hit it right. It read, "Freedom isn't a place, it's a message." And in that moment, everyone in that hallway, guards, psychologists, officers, felt the same thing. ADX hadn't broken him. It had just refined the myth. But soon, a discovery in Chicago would shake the Bureau's confidence again. A new coded letter, signed only with one word: Chairman. When a man becomes a symbol, even the system can't contain him. Years turned into decades inside the concrete silence of ADX Florence. Larry Hoover's name was still forbidden in official memos, but it pulsed quietly through urban culture, spoken in songs, whispered in neighborhoods, printed on murals that called him the voice they tried to silence. Outside those walls, the world kept shifting. Politicians rose and fell. New gangs claimed the streets. Yet, somehow, every generation rediscovered the same question: was Hoover still leading from the shadows, or had the myth outgrown the man? The Bureau of Prisons insisted he was neutralized. They released statements, denying any continued influence. But deep down, they knew something strange. Hoover's words, even decades old, still shaped behavior. His growth and development philosophy, once mocked as a smokescreen, was now being quoted by community groups trying to reduce violence. What had begun as gang rhetoric had evolved into a strange legacy, a mix of redemption and rebellion. Inside his cell, Hoover's world was static. The same walls. The same hum of artificial light. But in his mind, he was still organizing, this time not soldiers, but meaning. He reportedly told a chaplain, "They can't kill an idea that's already multiplied." That idea, that leadership could exist without freedom, had become both his victory and his curse. Because while his legend grew louder, his voice grew quieter. The longer he lived, the more invisible he became. In 2021, a movement began calling for his release. Celebrities spoke his name. Activists called him reformed. But for every supporter, there was a skeptic who remembered the blood his empire had spilled. The public debate blurred morality and myth. Was he a man who changed, or just a leader playing redemptionist strategy? The truth may never be clear. Even the guards who spent years watching him couldn't agree. Some said he'd mellowed, a philosopher in chains. Others said he never stopped calculating, never stopped building something unseen. But one fact remained: Larry Hoover's imprisonment had outlasted the very streets he once ruled. The gang he built splintered. His empire faded. Yet the idea that control, respect, and unity could exist even in the dark still breathed in places far from Colorado. In his 70s now, Hoover sits in near total isolation. Time has taken its toll. The myth remains young, but the man has grown old. The irony is haunting. The prison meant to erase him ended up preserving him, turning him into something America can't stop discussing, a reflection of power, punishment, and the human hunger for influence. As one retired warden put it, ADX didn't bury Larry Hoover. It made him eternal. The camera of history doesn't blink. It only waits. And somewhere, in that windowless cell deep in the Rockies, the man once called King Larry still sits in silence, proof that some revolutions never end. They just outlast the men who started them. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.